Okay, so today we're going to cover how to provide training. We're going to provide training to you, for how to train your FMS for the self-determination program eBilling functionality. So some of this may be a little bit of a repeat if you attended training on the previous days, but we're briefly going to cover the self-determination program, an overview of how it folds into processes on UFIS and eBilling. And then we're going to cover the eBilling program updates, so things that were changed in eBilling to accommodate the program. We'll be going over the eBilling financial management services provider user role and how to set up those user roles. And then we'll also be covering rendering services providers, how to search, add, assign to UCIs, and then how to do the master provider search and multiple provider upload, which are both financial management services provider admin activities. We'll also be covering consumer budgets, how to search for a consumer budget, because your FMS providers will need to do that. And then also invoicing, how to create, edit, save, and submit the self-determination program invoice. And then also the FMS administrator function of how to lock or unlock invoices. We'll also be covering the self-determination program payments tab and then eBilling report. So if you need a little background information or your FMS providers would like a little background information about self-determination, general information about the program can be found at the DDS website. We have the link there. It's the top link. It's www.dds.ca.gov/SCP. Policy-related training and other material can be found at the same website, but if you navigate to the SCP materials area, there's a lot of really good information out there for you. And then all of the eBilling and UFIS self-determination program materials will be posted at dds.ca.gov/AST. So if in a later date you need a copy of this PowerPoint presentation or this webinar, it will be at the AST portion of the DDS website. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. We might try to zoom in a little bit. So on screen, we have kind of the overarching flow of how a self-determination program will fold into the eBilling and UFIS activities. So self-determination begins when the consumer chooses the self-determination program, and then with the regional center, the budget is determined and the consumer selects the financial management services provider. At that point at the regional center, staff will enter a service delivery type for the consumer into their case management system. That service delivery type is S. And we didn't do that programming, but you should speak with your case management services provider because they can provide you more information about the screens and the function of how to do that. But that service delivery type information will be transferred into UFIS, and it will mark the consumer as being in the self-determination program. At that point, the regional center can create the authorization on UFIS and then also enter the budget into eBilling. The budget is then approved on eBilling, and once the budget is approved, it is available to the FMS provider for invoicing. So the FMS provider can go on when they need to and enter the self-determination program invoice. Once they're happy with that invoice, they can submit it for payment. And just like with traditional eBilling, that invoice information will be transferred over every night into UFIS. So that invoice information will be received in UFIS. It will generate an inbound audit report for the self-determination program invoices, very similar to the inbound audit report that you currently receive. At that point in time, that invoice is also assigned a UFIS invoice number. Once the invoice is transferred into UFIS, you can go to the screen and batch, accrue, and pay the invoice. Those are the same options that you currently use, but we've just put in some filters so you can choose to do the self-determination program invoices separately or together in a big batch, whichever way your regional center prefers. Once the invoice has been batched, accrued, and paid, that invoice information remains in UFIS, but if the vendor was paid with an electronic fund transfer, it will be transferred over into eBilling, as normally happens with your vendors now that do EFT. Okay, so I also want to cover some terminology that's a little bit different than traditional eBilling. So the first thing is the FMS, or the Financial Management Services Provider. So the FMS is the vendor that is going to be tied to your authorization and is required to be vendored by a regional center. The Rendering Services Provider is the person or entity providing the services to the consumer. This is information that is required to be on the Self-Determination Program invoice, but this person may not necessarily be vendored with anyone. The Service Delivery Type, this is the Service Delivery Type option that the consumer is selected to receive, and it's marked as an S for self-determination. This is entered into your case management system and is part of that functionality. And then also the consumer budget. This is the amount of regional center purchase of service funding available to the participant for the purchase of services and supports necessary to implement the IPP. So the consumer budget information will be entered into eBilling, and it will remain in eBilling. The budget will be debited when invoices are saved or submitted. So when the FMS creates an invoice, the budget will be debited appropriately. And the consumer budget is not the consumer authorization for services. So eBilling has been modified to accommodate the following: self-determination specific user roles. So when you or your FMS providers go to eBilling, you will actually go to the same link that you use now for eBilling, but you'll use a self-determination program specific login. So it will take you to the self-determination area of eBilling. Also, it has been modified to accommodate consumer budgets. That was very new. And self-determination program invoices. They look a little bit different than traditional invoices. And you'll notice when I covered the flow of authorizations and invoicing, unlike traditional e-billing, the regional center does not have to generate the invoice. The invoice generation starts with the FMS sender and then gets assigned a number once it goes into UFIS. So that was new. The Rendering Services Provider Management area, the self-determination specific reports. We added some reports that will hopefully make budget tracking a little bit easier. And then we updated the provider management terminology in both SDP e-billing and traditional e-billing, and we'll show you that in a second. So we had to rename the provider management tab on the right there to user management. This is where you go to add and maintain e-billing system users. The regional center and FMS both have the responsibility to do this. Regional centers can create other regional center users and FMS users, but you can create one FMS administrator user, and then the FMS administrator is able to create all of their users under them, so you don't have to manage all of their users if you don't want to. We also added the provider management tab on the left, and this is where FMS users are able to enter and maintain the rendering services provider information, so they can enter the person who's actually providing the service to the consumer. And this is an FMS user responsibility. This is not something that the regional centers will have to do or maintain. You're able to search as a regional center user, but not edit or modify. That's something the FMS can do. So are there any questions before we go on? Okay, well, if you guys come up with any questions, feel free to let us know.
Good morning, this is Kimberly with the application support team. I'm going to talk about the FMS specific user roles. The first one that we've created is similar to your vendor admin, but this is specifically an FMS admin SDP. Only the RC can create the FMS admin user role. They can view information only for the FMS numbers assigned to their user profile. This is similar to current functionality. They can view approved budgets associated to their FMS number. If you were part of the training with budgets, we went over the fact that the regional center has to approve a budget before it becomes available to the FMS. So once you have approved, you'll need to notify your FMS that it's available. They can create, save, and submit invoices. There's an Unlock Invoices feature, which we'll cover later on in this presentation. Add and maintain rendering service provider information. These are the services that the consumer the people who the consumer are getting services from. They can search the master provider list, and I'll cover what that is again when we cover master provider. They can upload a list of rendering service providers using a CSV file. They can view payments, run reports, and create and maintain user profiles associated to their vendor numbers. The next user role that the FMS will have available to them is an FMS Staff SCP. They can view information only for the FMS numbers assigned to their user profile. The FMS numbers and UCI numbers must be assigned. So an FMS vendor, when you approve budgets, they have the ability to assign out to specific lower user roles those specific UCIs. This way you don't have a bunch of people accessing the same budget and trying to invoice against the same budget if they shouldn't be involved with that particular consumer at all. They can add and maintain rendering service provider information, create and submit invoices. They have access to the Payments tab and access to the Reports tab. The FMS Staff SDP No Payment Access is exactly the same, except they do not have access to the Payment tab and they don't have access to the payment report.
Good morning, everyone. This is Luella with the Application Support Team, and I'm going to cover how to add users in eBilling. Adding users is pretty straightforward. You go to the User Management tab, and you have two functions. The Users tab is where you can search for users, and where you want to add user is the Add User tab. You want to create a username for your users, and you want this to be unique for each user. Fill out the required fields, which are indicated by the asterisk. And in the roles, you can choose from the drop-down list the appropriate role that you are assigning to a particular user, and just click Add.
So the FMS staff user roles, as were mentioned earlier, require an FMS and a UCI functionality to them. So when you click to add, the Assign FMS and the Assign UCI button display, boxes display. If the user is ready to assign an FMS number, they would select the button that's marked there with A, Assign FMS, and it's going to open up a new window that allows you to add an FMS. To assign the UCI number, you would select the Assign UCI button, and the UCIs that are going to display are only those where a budget for a consumer has been approved for your FMS. So this slide covers the window for assigning FMS assignments. We've provided step-by-step instructions on the slide for your FMS users that are going to be using this, and I'll just walk you through real quick. You would select the search button. It's going to display the FMS vendor numbers that have been assigned to your user role. You click on it, select the assign, and then save. The alternative is if you are removing a user, then you want to go ahead and remove the FMS number from their assignment, and you would select the FMS number from the window and then select the Remove Select FMS button and save. This is the UCI window. As Emily mentioned, the UCIs will automatically associate to the FMS number once the budget has been approved. So if I'm an FMS vendor and I'm creating lower user roles, when I open up the UCI assignment window, I can either search for a specific UCI or select the search button, and it'll display all UCIs that have been associated by an approved budget. I can then select UCIs and assign them out to the user, again, by selecting and using the buttons as displayed. Alternatively, if I want to remove a UCI from a user, I would select that, the remove selected UCI button, and save. So after you complete the assignments, this is what the user role will look like. Again, this is a lower level FMS staff user that has to have both the FMS number and the UCIs assigned to them. And then you just simply select the update button, and it will update the user's profile. Do we have any questions about the user setup for the FMS? Again, as a regional center, you'll be creating the FMS admin, but you don't have to worry about assigning out UCIs individually. No questions? Okay, now we're going to talk about provider management. So the rendering service provider management activity is located under the provider management tab. Excuse me. FMS staff users can search for existing rendering service providers, add new rendering service providers, and assign providers to consumers. Invoices cannot be completed until rendering service providers have been assigned to the consumer, and a user will get the error message if they try to create an invoice where no providers have been assigned.
Yeah, if the rendering provider has not been assigned to the consumer, when the user goes to the Invoice tab, they will get a message letting them know that rendering service provider needs to be assigned, and it will redirect them to the rendering provider tab. And once again, I just want to say that this functionality for the rendering provider is completely new to eBilling, so it will look different. And also, this is a functionality that the FMS is responsible for. So this is not a regional center activity. So the first thing that the user can do is they can search for providers. They can search for existing rendering providers under the Search Provider subtab. To do that, they would enter search criteria. They can enter a combination, or they can enter, one thing. I believe if you leave it blank and you click search, it will bring up all of the available rendering providers. So rendering providers that match the search criteria will display on the bottom of the screen. If no search criteria is entered, all providers will display. So you'll see down here we have any testing providers with the option of either editing, finding a UCI to assign it to, or deleting the provider. So to edit the rendering service provider information, you would select the Edit button. To assign a consumer to the rendering provider, you would select the Find UCI button. And if you want to delete the provider, you'd obviously click the Delete button. So if you want to add a new rendering provider, which is something I'm sure the FMS will be doing a bit of in the beginning, you first must search to make sure that it doesn't exist in the system. We were trying to cut down on the number of duplicates. So you would enter the search criteria. You would click search. If the provider does not display, you would add the required information. So the required information is marked with the little red star. So you definitely have to enter a provider ID. This can be whatever the FMS vendor wants. So if they have a numbering or lettering system for keeping track of their rendering providers, they can enter that here. They also have to enter a company name and address with a city and a state. The other information is optional. Once they enter the correct information, they would select Add Provider, and the provider will be added to the system, and then it will be available to assign to consumers.
Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about is actually assigning the provider to the UCI. They can do this one of two ways. One, when they go to the provider management tab, there is a sub-tab that says assign UCI, or they can do a search, and as you saw on the previous display, click on the assign UCI button, or find UCI button, sorry. It'll take them to this rendering provider search UCI screen. Depending on which way they entered, you would search for and select a consumer, and then search for the provider. And then once you select the provider from the list, you would click on the Assign Provider to UCI button. In the upper right-hand corner of the display, you'll see that the provider is assigned in this window. So when you go to the screen and you pull up a UCI, it'll display a list of all of the providers assigned to this particular UCI. You have the option to delete them as long as they have not been used on an invoice. Is there any questions? No questions about providers? So another new functionality that's given to the RC administrator is the Master Provider Search feature. It'll allow them to copy rendering service providers entered by other FMSs within their regional center catchment area. The Master Provider Search screen also features an upload option that will allow for a large number of service providers to be uploaded into SDP for the FMS.
And just to be clear, this is functionality for the FMS admin user. They are able to search all non-private rendering providers that are located in the system, so that if you have FMS vendors who are sharing rendering service providers, they are able to copy that record and pull it into their bucket of rendering service providers, assign their own unique provider ID, and then use it on their invoices as needed. And then we also, and we're going to go through it, there's an upload option. So if they want, when they start, to input like 100 providers at once, they're able to upload those from a document that looks like a spreadsheet. So they cut down on the manual entry.
So to navigate to the Master Provider Search area, they would select the Provider Management tab and then the Master Provider Search sub-tab. It's the Search Existing Rendering Providers option on the left, and then it'll also display the rendering providers already associated to the FMS on the right, and down at the bottom you'll see the Upload File feature. So to begin, they would search for the provider that they're looking for. Once they find and click a provider, the button changes and it says copy rendering service provider. Once they do that, oh, wait a minute, this is my explanation slide. Sorry about that. So this is more stepped out for the FMSs that explains what each little box window was, which I kind of just did on the previous slide. Okay, so now they would search for an existing rendering provider. Again, they would type in either some type of criteria, or they could just select the search button. The list of providers matching criteria is going to display. This is where it gets a little tricky. Once they actually select the provider, you'll notice that there's no provider IDs associated to this, and that is because down at the bottom of the list, where the #1 button is, the reason why is because this actually belongs to somebody else, and they have their own provider ID nomenclature set up. So this will allow the FMS to copy that information and actually assign their own provider ID schema to it. So they select it, they have to type in a provider ID, and then they can click the Assign Provider to FMS button, and it's going to copy the provider information to their FMS. So from the previous screen, I had copied Emily's testing vendor, and now she displays as an available provider to me. Again, you can delete any of the rendering service providers if they were added incorrectly, and once again, only if it hasn't been used on an invoice. So you'll notice that first line does not have a delete button option there, and that is because it's already been used on an invoice. So we figured that some of these FMSs that have already been handling various service providers for under their general business will have information already in their system, and we allowed them the option to go ahead and download from their existing system into an Excel file and then saving it as a CSV. This option is available when you do the save as in Excel. And they basically just need to provide the provider ID, the company name, the address, the city, and the state. When they upload, they don't have to use any headers. They can, but it'll tell them that one line has been rejected, and that's usually the header line. So once they have their CSV file saved, then they would click in the box next to the Select File button. Please note, you can't click the Select File button. You have to click in the box. Then it's going to open up a typical display window of Windows, allow you to search for your CSV file that you're looking for, select it and click the Open button, and then it will provide a confirmation box saying how many uploaded or failed during the process. Questions?
Hello.
Hi.
How many characters are allowed in the provider ID field?
I believe it's 10, but I think there's a minimum of 3 requests that have to be input.
Is there a suggested format for the provider ID number?
They can do whatever they want with it. However they have their general schema set up is what we figured that they would carry over, and typically an ID field is no larger than 10 characters. But I'll double check that, and we will provide some formatting information associated to these fields for how many characters are allowed when we post the additional information on the ASQ website.
Yeah, and if your regional center has some sort of provider ID naming convention that you'd like your vendors to follow, you are welcome to provide that to them and let them know that's how they need to have them input.
Good morning. This is Ben from Inland.
Hi, Sam.
Should the provider ID be the test ID? Is that a field for the test ID of the provider?
Yeah, the test ID here, let me go back to that slide. That is where the provider ID would be. That was just what we used for testing. Previous. You're talking about that column A? Yeah, that would be where you would put the provider ID, I believe.
Yeah, but how about the like a test ID like EIN or Social Security number for 1099 purpose?
Whatever you do, I would do not use a Social Security number or a tax ID. Yeah, that would not be a good security practice. Do not use that. That field is not masked the way that a social security number field would be. And in fact, we originally had a field where you would be inputting SSNs on this software, but our security office worked with us and we removed that.
So my next question is, does the FMS need to file 1099 for for each of the provider of $500?
You know, I'm not sure about that, Finn. I can check with our business program staff. So your question is, does the FMS provider need to file one 1099 or a separate 1099 for every single rendering provider?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You know, we can follow up with that for program. For our purposes, only the vendored FMS service provider will be in UFIS.
Okay, I just want to make sure that there's a way that FMS file a 1099 for
just one
for everyone, the provider who all have $500 over.
Okay, UFIS is only going to have the functionality to create a 1099.
But UFIS doesn't have the provider info.
No.
Yeah,
the FMS.
UFIS will not have the rendering provider information. UFIS will only have the FMS provider.
It's not.
I know, but the FMS, they need to do the 1099 for the...
The FMS is going to have their own accounting system and their own way of their dollars that they pay a service provider, because they may have more than one person associated to that service provider, and they should be tracking that information in their own payout.
So basically, the FMS need to keep track the tax ID outside in a separate, their own system. Okay.
That would be correct.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Are there any other questions about the rendering provider management? I know it's a lot of information and it's totally new. Okay, so basically, just to reiterate, the rendering service provider management is functions that your FMS providers will be in charge of doing. So they can add, search for, copy rendering service providers and assign them to UCI numbers. Then they will also be able to upload multiple rendering providers at one time if needed.
Which one's that?
Okay. If anyone, so this information will be available on the ASP website, but in the interim, if you have any questions regarding the rendering provider information, please feel free to forward your questions to IT, S as in Sam, D as in dog, P as in Paul, at dds.ca.gov. Those emails go to the entire IT SDP team, so someone will see your question right away and then get back to you. How are we on time? No, I don't have the schedule. I have the schedule, but it's on the screen. I closed it.
I'm going to go over the consumer budget search function. Users can search for existing budgets in the Budgets tab under Budget Search. They can access the tab, they can access the budgets by either entering specific search criteria or just clicking on the search button. The search button will display all of the budgets that have been approved by the regional center and are available for invoicing.
And again, the FMS can only view the budget. They cannot make any modifications to it.
And they can only view budgets for consumers that have been linked to their user profile.
So for the FMS, when they're ready to create an invoice, they're going to navigate to the SDP Invoices tab. And underneath that, you have 3 sub-tabs. The SDP Invoice, where they actually create the invoice. The unsubmitted invoices. So these are any that they may have created and saved. There's a sub-tab that they can navigate to search for, and then edit, modify, or delete ones they've already created. And then the SDP invoice history are submitted invoices that they can view. These can't be modified or deleted. So to begin creating an SDP invoice, again, they would go to the SDP invoice subtab, type in a UCI number, or they can also do first and last name. A window will display as the characters are typed to provide a drop-down list to select from. For current budgets, new invoices are created through that SDP invoice subtab. Historical or older budgets, so this is once we've gotten in like a year after the program, and the consumer may have a new budget for the current year, they would actually have to create the invoice off of the actual budget in the budget search tab. And then again, rendering service providers must be assigned to the consumer before creating an invoice. So as I mentioned, first they would enter a UCI number. Once they select the consumer, information about the consumer's budget displays. So the first there is the invoice date, then the budget begin date and the budget end date, and then the dollar amounts that are allocated to the budget categories, and the total allocated budget amount are there in the middle of the window. In order to start creating the invoice, they actually have to select the Add Row button. This will bring up a line where they would select the budget categories, enter the service code, enter the service month and year, the invoice amount, and then select rendering service provider. Rendering service provider is available from a drop-down. Over on the right-hand side of the screen, underneath number 3, where it says fill out information lines with the appropriate information, as you start inputting dollar amounts to the different budget categories, the available funds will self-calculate down. So here's an example of where they continued adding lines. And again, they have to complete service month, year, service code, invoice amount, and rendering service provider. The invoices are only allowed to be for one specific service month and year. So once they select the service month and year on the first line, each subsequent line will automatically populate with that information. Because all the dollar amounts are tied to the budget categories, they are forced to delete a line if the wrong dollar amount is input. And so you'll see the delete button available on the right-hand side of the invoice line. As mentioned before, it has to be the same service month year. However, they can use multiple budget categories and service codes on an invoice. It will not allow them to use the same service code twice. So they can only input a dollar amount. For example, if they actually had 2 different services doing 310 respite in home, they would have to create one invoice with one rendering service provider, and they would actually have to create another invoice if they had a different service provider providing that service as well for the same month. Again, once the invoice lines have been completed, they can't be modified, and so they'll have to delete the button and add a row again.
I'm going to go over how you can save, submit, and close your invoices. Once the invoice is complete, you can either save, submit, or close it. When you submit it, the invoice can't be modified. If you save it, you can still modify it, but know that it has not been submitted. If you don't want to submit or save it, you can simply close it, and it will take you back to the invoice entry screen. You can only modify unsubmitted invoices, and only one user at a time should modify the invoice. To do this, you navigate to the Unsubmitted Invoice Search tab, enter your search criteria, and select Search. To edit the invoice, you will find an Edit button, and along with that, you can also delete it and just click on the Delete button. If you are editing your invoice, let's say, for example, you want to add a row, you just click Add Row and pretty much follow the step that Kim just went through, and go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
If you want to edit an invoice line, such as changing the rendering service provider, that option is available. Again, this is after an invoice has already been saved, not after, not while it's in the create process. And if they want to delete a line, they can delete it. Certain features are not going to be editable in this option, such as the service month year. And as once you edit the button, use the edit button to change something, there'll be a save option available on each invoice line that gets changed. Again, this is done because of the way the budget has to update with the dollar amounts that are input for the services. If they don't want to change anything, they can click cancel. And then after they complete the invoice, they can either close or submit the invoice, or again, they can keep adding additional lines. So close will save the changes, and selecting submit will save the changes and submit the invoice for payment. Are there any questions about the invoice creation process? Do you want me to go back over any of the features?
Question. I'm Antonia from Regional Center East Bay.
Uh-huh.
And I have a couple questions. So my first question is so you said that we can only have one service month. So what happens if we have the FMS that wants to bill for 2 months? So are they just creating 2 separate invoices then?
Yes. And the reason why we had to do it this way is because UFIS does not allow for multiple service months and years on an invoice.
Okay. And I have one more question.
Mm-hmm.
My second question is last week it was mentioned that if an invoice is submitted and, for example, it exceeds the budget, then the POS staff will delete that invoice. when an invoice is submitted, does that then mean that it goes into the FMS's invoice history tab, or how do they track when the regional center has deleted an invoice for some reason?
Right. Okay. So just for clarification, the FMS cannot invoice over the dollar amounts allocated in the budget. So on the UFIS side, if for some reason a specific service is over the authorized amount on your system, then yes, the UFIS side will reject it. And when you delete it, it gets flagged, and it'll go back into eBilling. The FMS vendor will get an email saying that the invoice was rejected, and they can look for the invoice in the SDP invoice history subtab. We were not able, the email will provide a little bit of information to them about the rejection of the invoice, but it does not go into a bunch of detail. So if you do end up deleting an invoice and sending it back, some type of communication with the FMS does need to occur.
Okay. Thank you.
One more question.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Hassan from South Central. This is Hassan from South.
Okay, whoever was speaking first.
Ladies first.
Ladies first. Thank you. You said that they cannot bill for the same service code and the same month. Isn't it possible for FMS provider to use two different, let's say, transportation providers in the same month?
Yes, that's going to be possible. They just have to put them on separate invoices.
Oh, so you can have, okay, you cannot combine it under the same invoice, but you can have two different invoices for the same month and the same service code.
Correct. And we've made sure that UFIS can accommodate that. Hassan?
Oh, yeah, and my question actually was related to the first one. So when they submitted an invoice and we rejected here from the fiscal side, and email went back to them and they redo that one, the original invoice that was deleted, will that still be on the invoice history on their side, on the FMS?
Yes, it will. And once it's been deleted in UFIS and eBilling receives that information, it puts the money back into the budget.
Yes, but that invoice will still be existing on the history, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's my question. All right, thank you.
Emily, this is Isabel. I emailed you a question because the chat button is not working, and it's regarding the rendering provider, the setup of it. I don't know if you have access to your email.
Let me pull those up.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so the first question, can everyone hear me? I'm a little far. The field, the first question is regarding the setup of the rendering service provider ID. The question is the field is a minimum of 3 characters and a maximum of 10 characters? And I believe so, yes, there is a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 10 characters. And it can be a combination of letters and numbers. There are no DDS established guidelines for the provider IDs for the rendering service provider setup. We left that up to the regional centers so you guys could choose what works best for your business processes. You know, some of the FMS providers may have naming conventions for their rendering services providers already. If they don't, you know, you guys can choose to do what you want, but if you came up with some sort of convention, if I was in charge of this, I maybe would abbreviate somehow the FMS provider name and then use a combination of the rendering provider name and a number for the provider ID, so it would be easier for me to track if I was searching for things. But there are all sorts of ways you could do it. You could make sure that like every rendering provider that's a similar service type, so like all the transportation ones, all had something to indicate in their provider ID that they were transportation. But basically, there isn't any set guidelines, so you can choose to use whatever works best for your regional center. And then the next question, if an FMS borrows or copies a rendering service provider, does the provider ID follow them to their new FMS? And no, it does not. So the FMS providers can each choose their own unique rendering service provider IDs. And then let's see, the last question, where does the borrowing? Yeah, no, the last question goes along with that. So if you borrow or copy a rendering service provider, so if Kim is an FMS and I'm an FMS, Emily, and Kim's got 10 rendering service providers and I copy one of hers and bring it over into my bucket, all the information such as the name and the address will stay the same, but I am prompted to assign a new provider ID to it. So if she has her naming convention for her rendering service providers, she can keep that, and I can keep my naming convention for my rendering service providers. Does that answer the question? Okay, good.
It does, thank you.
Anything else?
I think we'll cover this last slide and then we'll go ahead and take a break. Advanced funds. It hasn't been determined if the feature will be utilized, so more detailed training will be provided in the future if it's determined that it is needed. All right, well, I have 10:15, so we'll go ahead and get started. Back, there were 2 questions that came in during the break. One of them was, do you have an example of the email that FMS will receive if an invoice is deleted? And on your screens now, you should see a clip of that. So in this amount, or in this particular rejection, it's going to tell them their invoice number from eBilling, which was 76, and it was rejected because the dollar amount was more than what was available and encumbered on the service. So as you can see, it's not very informative to them. So additional communication does need to be done. The second question we had was, what will happen if 2 users make changes to the invoice at the same time? And you're jumping the gun a little bit with training here, and we're going to talk about that next. As soon as I find the slide.
From Regional Center East Bay, I have a question about the email you just showed.
Uh-huh.
So when that email goes out, that's going to go directly to the FMS. Will the regional center staff receive that in their sent email, or will there be record as far as on the regional center side of those emails going out?
Your reports that you get when the invoices are submitted will tell you the invoices that are going to be rejected.
Okay.
And no, I don't believe that the email gets directed to the regional center. I'll double check on that. But the email is going to go to the FMS administrator. So the FMS administrator roles will receive the email.
Okay, so the FMS administrator over. Okay, I think I'm clear.
Okay, so the second question was, what will happen if two users make changes to the invoice at the same time? And that is where Invoice Lock comes in.
In SDP eBilling, we have a feature called Invoice Lock, and the purpose of the Invoice Lock is to prevent multiple users from creating an invoice on the same budget. So basically, only one user can create an invoice for a budget. Any other users will get an error message that will display that there's an invoice in progress for the UCI and budget. An invoice can keep a budget locked in the following scenarios: when the connection to eBilling is lost during invoicing, and when the user incorrectly exits eBilling while creating an invoice. If one of these scenarios occurs, the user will receive the invoicing in progress error message, and the FMS administrator must unlock the budget.
And I just want to reiterate here that this is a function for the FMS administrator user. So if the FMS vendors are having multiple people try to invoice, or they've closed out of eBilling without saving the invoice and they try to go back and they're getting that message, they will not be calling the regional center. They should be directing those questions to their FMS administrator user, because that is the user who has the ability to unlock the invoice.
To remove the invoice lock, the FMS administrator should go to the SDP Invoice tab and select Unlock Invoicing UCI tab. A list of current locked UCIs will display along with the user who locked the invoice. If the user who is requesting the unlock is not the same as the user that has the lock, the user with the lock should not be doing any invoicing before the lock is removed. The UCI should be typed into the UCI field, and the user from the list that is displayed should be selected. To unlock the UCI, select Unlock UCI button. Are there any questions about this feature?
Okay, well, we'll move on to payment. So this is very similar to traditional e-billing. This should look similar to you if you are familiar with traditional e-billing. So we have a tab that we have called SDP Payment. So all of your vendors that get paid with an electronic fund transfer, that information will be available on e-billing for them to view under the SDP Payments tab. This is the same functionality as traditional e-billing. So once they get paid on UFIS, that information can be transferred back into e-billing. Also, the Reports tab. This will also look very similar to you if you are familiar with traditional e-billing. To view reports, FMS users will go to the Reports tab, and they'll select the report they would like to view from the drop-down menu. Additional reports, so we have all of the reports that are available with traditional e-billing, but we've also added additional reports and functionality for the self-determination program. So basically, it functions the same. The user selects the report from the drop-down menu. They enter the specific criteria and select the Submit button, and the report either appears on screen, it can appear in a new window, or they can be pulled into like an Excel file, which is the same as traditional e-billing. So, and just like in traditional e-billing, the FMS staff no payment access user role is not able to view the EFT payment history, summary, and detail reports. So I'm just going to go through a quick list of the reports. We have the invoice summary report that displays a summary of all the invoices that will meet your specified search criteria. I believe you have to at minimum enter an FMS number. The invoice detail report, it displays a detailed report of all invoices that meet the specified search criteria, and this will bring up detail. So the summary report will bring you up like a list of invoices. The detail report will bring up a detail of one specific invoice, so you can see all the lines on it. The invoice history report will bring up a summary of all of the submitted invoices that meet your search criteria, and the invoice history detail report will bring up the detail of a submitted invoice that meets your criteria. So once again, the invoice history will bring you up a list of like all the submitted invoices, and the invoice history detail will bring up the specific details of one invoice, whatever matches your criteria. We also have the SDP submitted invoice report, SDP unsubmitted invoice report. So those are, bring up the SDP invoices that are submitted or not submitted, depending on the report and the criteria. We have the SDP rejected invoice report. This will display a report of rejected invoices. I think some of these I believe are admin reports. We also have the UCI assigned to the SPN report. This will display a report of the UCI numbers that meet specified search criteria. And then the budget information report. This displays a summary of the budget information that meets the search criteria. We also have a budget history report. So this will bring up historical budget information. You can enter a consumer UCI and the time period, and it will bring up the budget amounts and the debits and the credits from that time period. We also have a report that deals with advanced funds. In the future, if that feature is used, we'll provide more training and information at that time. We have a monthly budget statement for FMS report. So this is where you input the FMS number. They'll be able to enter a UCI number, run the report, and it will display kind of like a base statement for the specified time period of what the budget amounts were at the beginning of the month, all of the invoices submitted against those budget categories, and then what is remaining at the end of the month. And then we also have the EFT payment history summary report and the EFT payment history detail report. These are the same as what is available in traditional eBilling. So are there any questions about the reports? I know it's a little hard with without seeing them all, but they're very similar to traditional eBilling. We tried very hard to keep the functionality similar so it would be familiar to everyone, and then just added a few additional reports to help with the tracking of the self-determination program budgets and stuff.